Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about how our political system is set up to allow a minority to run it, the history behind it, and how it is exploited. My guest for this is Ari Berman. Ari Berman is the national voting rights correspondent for Mother Jones and a reporting fellow at Type Media Center. He is the author of a number of books, including his latest. It's called Minority Rule, the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it. Ari Berman, it's my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Hey, Mitch. Good to talk to you again. Thank you.
I rarely begin. I try not to start an interview by asking about a title of a book, but I do think it is important for the course of our discussion, to understand what is meant by this term, minority rule. What do you mean when you use that term, minority rule?
What I mean is when a minority faction has a majority of power despite not holding majority support. Now, when I talk about minority rule, I'm talking about an elite conservative white minority holding power, not historically disenfranchised communities holding power. In fact, I'm talking about an elite conservative white minority holding power precisely by disenfranchising minorities as we tend to think of them in terms of historically marginalized or disadvantaged groups. So it's a little bit counterintuitive because I think the concept of minority rights is really important in a democracy. But when you have a privileged minority that's ruling in spite of having majority support, that's what becomes dangerous.
It is interesting, the term minority, because I think for most of our lives, when we'd say minority, we'd mean some kind of franchised group within our country. And I think we used to talk about the system of American government to protect minority rights. Is it the same dynamic though that's being used for the laws and the system that would protect a disenfranchised group as a minority, and this other minority now that you talk about, this privileged, wealthier, rich white group? Is it the same dynamic?
It's really kind of the opposite, because the way often that minority rights are protected is to make sure that democratic rights are protected, because that's what often protects those previously disenfranchised minorities. So things that we think about like basic First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, but then more than that, things like the right to vote that would bring those historically disenfranchised communities into the political system. In fact, many of the ways that minority rule exists today in terms of an elite privileged white minority ruling is doing anti-democratic things like voter suppression, gerrymandering, dark money, the stacking of the courts, that often result in outcomes that would hurt those historically disenfranchised minorities, and actually would be premised on trying to shut out those previously disenfranchised minorities from ruling. Because what I'm arguing essentially is that in America, there is an emerging new American majority, and it's made up of young people, moderate to progressive whites, voters of color. They are forming a new majority, and we are entering a situation in which the U.S. will one day be a majority-minority country, in which white people will no longer be the majority. And I'm essentially arguing that this conservative white minority is trying to prevent the day where they, in terms of white people more broadly, become a minority and are trying to create a system that will enshrine their power even in the face of these demographic changes.
I get the sense that demographic changes is sort of fueling all of what we are seeing on this dynamic.
It's fueling a lot of it. I mean, I begin the book talking about Pat Buchanan in the 1990s, the conservative commentator and presidential candidate. And I start talking about him in the beginning of the book because Buchanan is the first to warn in the 1990s that we will have this majority-minority future. The Census Bureau predicts that it'll happen in the 1990s. It predicts it'll happen by 2050. And Buchanan starts talking about this. And he said, white Americans are one day going to become the minority, and we have to do something about it. Don't accept that this is a good thing. This is a bad thing. It's a danger to white Christian America as we know it, but it's also an existential crisis for the Republican Party, because the Republican Party is a largely white party. It's even whiter today than it was back then, but it's a largely white party. And basically, he is arguing that the changing demographics should be a new front in the country's culture wars. And I think that argument gained some traction back then, but of course Buchanan never comes close to getting his party's nomination. But I think it starts to accelerate with the election of Barack Obama, because that is a very key indicator of the changing demographics of the country having an impact, an unprecedented impact. And then, of course, it accelerates with Donald Trump. And I think when Donald Trump talks about make America great again, I think obviously the again part is before we had all these demographic changes and before there was all these new multiracial coalitions and all these new people were enfranchised and participating in politics.
So this minority rule is about a group who has always ruled, but is an attempt to continue to do so.
Yeah, I mean, basically, yes, although there have been periods of time when the American system has been more democratic. Or put it this way, there have been times when both parties have been committed to winning over a majority. Now, for example, there were a lot of things I didn't like about Ronald Reagan and his presidency. But when he wins 49 of 50 states, it's hard to argue that the Republican Party is captive to minority rule. I mean, we probably didn't agree with the policies, right? But the fact is they were a majority party at that point in time. I mean, they weren't a party that said we can only win the Electoral College, we can't win the popular vote, right? But I think what you've seen more recently in Trump's Republican Party is they're not just benefiting from a long-standing undemocratic political system that goes back to the founding. They're specifically saying we want to take over these counter-majoritarian institutions. We don't care if we lose the popular vote as long as we win the Electoral College. We don't care if we have a Senate majority that represents fewer Americans. We're just going to use every bare-knuckle tactic we can get through. We don't care if the Supreme Court does things that are at odds with public opinion. That's why we created the conservative supermajority on the court to begin with. So I think the counter-majoritarian impulse in the Republican Party has gotten stronger more recently as they feel like they are outnumbered and as they feel like the demographics of the country are changing. And I'm not sure they felt that way in the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s, for example.
Tell me more about these counter-majoritarian institutions. I imagine we're talking about the Senate, probably Electoral College, perhaps the Supreme Court, maybe others.
Well, those are the big ones in terms of the federal institutions, and it goes all the way back to the founding. I talk about this from the beginning of the book on, that a lot of this is built into the Constitution. The founding fathers were very concerned about democracy, broadly speaking, and they were concerned about the power of the masses. Now, they wanted to empower the masses, but they didn't want to empower them too much, that the majority would infringe on what back then was a very privileged white minority. And the founding fathers were keenly aware that they were, as a rich white property holding, in many cases slave holding elite, that they were a distinct minority that needed to be protected. And they weren't concerned with minorities as we tend to think of them that much, like African Americans, women, even poor whites were someone that they didn't really express too much concern about. In many cases, they were afraid of all of these forces. So they created these institutions to try to shield themselves from democratic participation. They created a complicated electoral college system because they didn't believe that the people should be able to directly elect the president, or that it would threaten certain interests. James Madison, who was the most influential founding father, actually says at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, I think the people should elect the president. The problem is it'll hurt the slave states because the slave states have fewer people, fewer voters than the free states because so much of their population is enslaved. So he's basically coming out and saying a direct election is going to hurt the slaveholding South. So we get this complicated electoral college system. Then it comes to the U.S. Senate. The founders want senators to be appointed by the states because they want it to be an elite body. But a lot of the founders wanted to operate on the basis of majority rule once you have that elite body. They want it to be based on proportional representation. Then the small states basically say, no, we are going to leave the union if we don't give us the same number of senators per state. So that creates a situation where you have minority rule, because from the very beginning, these small states have the same power as the large states. And even at the time, Madison is foreseeing this is going to get worse as new states are being added to the union. It gets exponentially worse. Then you have a situation with the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is going to be nominated by presidents who are not elected by the people and chosen by senators that are biased towards more smaller, more conservative areas. So even from the beginning, these institutions are skewed. Even the House of Representatives, which is the only elected branch of the government at the time, it's skewed because of the 3/5 clause. Basically, Southern states again say, if our enslaved people aren't counted, we're going to have less power. Kind of like the Electoral College, this complicated arrangement is settled where slaves are counted as 3/5 of the people for purpose of representation. That meant that the Southern states had a third more power than they otherwise would have if slaves were not counted. So that's just on the federal level. And then, of course, there were things in the states like gerrymandering. Back then it was malapportionment, but like gerrymandering that would affect an undemocratic outcome at the state level. So in all of these ways, minority rule is basically built into the system.
I'm going to come back to the Constitutional Convention in a moment because I think it's important and even interesting why we had it and what were the forces at play. But before I do that, lay out for me, and it's really fascinating when you do this in your book, about how these numbers play out today. And I guess what I mean by that, and maybe we can talk both about the Senate and then maybe the Supreme Court. If you just look at the numbers, each state has 2 senators, but each state obviously doesn't have equal population. If you were to look at the Senate as population, right? It's remarkable that what the Republicans, you'll explain this better than I can right now, but in the last 50 years or so, Republicans, if you only went by population, would have ruled the Senate only once or something like that.
Yeah, I think the statistic is over the last 20 years or so, Republicans have represented a majority of Americans only once in 1998. But and
that means they got the vote. They got the majority of votes in elections for the Senate.
So yeah, the election. Mm-hmm. So all of this, if you count up the votes for all the Senate elections at the time, they only represented a majority of Americans once since 1998. But they've controlled the Senate half the time since then. So it's basically the Senate is a coin flip, every 2 years. But they're basically haven't represented a majority of Americans for over 20 years. And the reason for that is the gap between large and small states keeps increasing. So in 1790, when Madison is warning about the danger of small states ruling the Senate, the country's largest state, Virginia, had 13 times the population of the smallest state, Delaware. And Madison was worried about that at the time. Well, today, California has 68 times the population of Wyoming, meaning that Wyoming has 68 times the voting power in the Senate as California does. And of course, you look at the Electoral College. The Electoral College is based not just on population, but representation in the Senate and the House. That means that these sparsely populated states have more power in the Electoral College as well, even if they're not swing states in terms of how electors are allocated. Wyoming would have 4 times as much power than California in the Electoral College as well. So the small state representation of the Senate, it skews the Senate, it skews the Electoral College, and of course it skewed the Supreme Court, because what's happened is most recently 5 of 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court were appointed by Republican presidents who lost the popular vote and confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans. That's never happened before in U.S. history. So the fact that you have Republican presidents routinely losing the popular vote, senators routinely representing a minority of Americans, these are relatively recent developments in terms of how frequently they're happening.
Let me come back to that Supreme Court point. A majority, 5 of the justices, were nominated by a president that lost the popular vote in the election. Now, George Bush won the second election by a popular vote, but not the first one, not in 2000. So a majority of justices on the court were put there by a Republican who actually lost the popular vote.
Yeah, and it's pretty astounding. I mean, of course, and then it's not just that, but it's also the way that court was configured, right? Because it's not like they just won and they said, we're going to get our people on there. They actively, of course, prevented other presidents from putting their own justice on the court. So, I mean, Barack Obama wins overwhelmingly, a huge popular vote and electoral college victory in 2012. He's prevented by Mitch McConnell for putting Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court 8 months before the election. Then McConnell turns around, puts Neil Gorsuch on the court, and then 8 days before the election puts Amy Coney Barrett on the court. So I mean, like, it's both a product of the fact that you have Republicans capturing these anti-democratic institutions, but then you also have them using even more anti-democratic hardball tactics to further capture these institutions. So they're doing, I think, whatever they can to try to deepen minority rule. And I think the courts have been so important to the Republicans because they've basically made the courts their vehicle for doing all of these unpopular things that they couldn't do through the normal course of business. So they never were going to overturn Roe v. Wade through legislation. It was way too popular. They never were going to gut the Voting Rights Act through legislation. It was way too popular. They had to look to the courts to do this. And I think that's why the courts have been the organizing principle for the Republican Party for 30 or 40 years, certainly since Roe v. Wade, but I would argue probably even before that, because they said only by getting these institutions that are not accountable to the people, they should be accountable to the other branches of government, but of course they haven't been. That's the way that we can push through this radical anti-democratic agenda. Then of course will deepen minority rule in the country more broadly.
So they take over the Supreme Court in an undemocratic way, and then the Supreme Court continues to entrench that kind of a system.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it entrenches it through a few different ways. First, it just makes the political system more undemocratic and more responsive to Republican interests by doing things like gutting the Voting Rights Act, upholding partisan and racial gerrymandering, Citizens United. I mean, these are all things that made the country less democratic and also easier for Republicans to rig the system. Then they've also done things that make the country more counter-majoritarian, like doing things like overturning Roe v. Wade, overturning gun control laws, things that are supported by 70 to 80% of Americans. They're basically saying, we don't care about public opinion. We're going to do it anyway. And that puts the court in a volatile situation where it's directly at odds with the people, even though the people feel like there's nothing they can do about it. And then I think most recently, they have made the system more authoritarian by preventing there from being any kind of major trial for Trump inciting the insurrection. I mean, it's June 6th. We're still waiting on them to rule about what's going to happen with Trump being heard for his federal election subversion case. I mean, so they've gone from kind of indirectly boosting Trump to now directly boosting him. And I think that they feel like they are not going to face any consequences for their actions. I think you're clearly seeing that in the actions of Samuel Alito in terms of defending the flag, refusing to recuse, John Roberts saying he won't do anything about it, Clarence Thomas not recusing in cases involving the insurrection, even though his wife helped organize the insurrection. I mean, they feel like they're not going to face any accountability from the people, and they're not going to face any accountability from the other branches of government. In the past, when the Supreme Court has done things that the other branches didn't like, the other branches stepped in and did something. But right now, the Congress has been unable to do anything about it. I think part of the reason why the Congress has been able to do anything about it has been because of some of these counter-majoritarian forces that are built into the system. So, for example, 48 senators wanted to restore the Voting Rights Act, but it was blocked by the filibuster, which essentially prevented there from being any kind of real majority vote on this kind of thing. So I think increasingly, not only is the Supreme Court feel like there's no accountability from the other branches of government, it's almost acting like it's above the other branches of government in terms of its actions.
Do you feel like this is an unprecedented moment when it comes to trying to rig the system towards one faction's benefit?
I feel like it's unprecedented in one sense, but there's been efforts to do it before. I mean, when Jim Crow was put into effect, right, and multiracial democracy was overthrown in the South, you had a situation where all the different branches of government had to buy into that, right? The president, not just both presidents. I mean, the difference is it's really one party doing it. Back then, it was more of a bipartisan consensus. But you basically had presidents who gave up on upholding black voting rights, Congress who gave up on upholding black voting rights, and a Supreme Court that upheld it, that gave up on it. I think the difference, though, is that in the past, when there's been this anti-democratic system in place, it had more bipartisan support, meaning it had buy-in from both parties to maintain the status quo. I think the difference here is that it's really only one party doing it, and doing it in a remarkably successful way. And I think that's really what is unprecedented right now. And certainly if you look at the skews in the Senate, the skews in the Supreme Court, the skews in the Electoral College, those are new. And then the fact that you have a president that is so willing not just to take advantage of this system, but to smash any kind of democratic norm that stands in his way, that is also new. We've never had a president who's a convicted felon. We've never had a president who's been indicted 4 times. Never had a president who tried to overturn an election and incite an insurrection. So in that case, it's all unprecedented. But I think the purpose of my book, which makes it different than a lot of other books, is I'm saying this crisis also is a lot older and deeper than Trump.
Yeah, it seems to me what's particularly remarkable right now is we have a political system in which there are two ruling parties that see each other as an existential threat. I mean, the only time I can think of this in our history is maybe a couple times, obviously the Civil War, and then maybe between Adams and Jefferson when Adams was having Republican presses, writers jailed, but not in my lifetime, not in the 20th century. Can I think of a time when the two ruling sides, we always complain that they were one and the same, but there seems to clearly have been a rupture.
Yeah, and I mean, I also think that the difference is they both see each other as an existential threat. But I think one side, the Democratic Party, however flawed, by and large, I think believes in democratic norms, and I think would like to uphold the democratic system we have today. And the other party, the Republican Party, doesn't really believe in democratic norms anymore and would like to overthrow as much as possible the democratic system we have today. So I think it's different. You probably have to go back to the Civil War to find that, where one party essentially is trying to overthrow the system. That's what, or in case of the White South, they wanted to uphold the system of slavery, but they wanted to overthrow the democratic system, if that's what it meant to uphold slavery, right? They thought that slavery was more important than the Union. And the other side, by and large, wanted to keep the democratic system, but get rid of slavery, or who knows? I mean, there were a lot of different factors in terms of what they were fighting for. But I mean, you almost have to go back that far to sort of see the parties become so polarized and see kind of one side that has so radicalized against democracy as we know it.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Ari Berman. Ari Berman is National Voting Rights Correspondent for Mother Jones and a reporting fellow at Type Media Center. He's the author of the book, Minority Rule, The Right-Wing Attack on the Will of the People and the Fight to Resist It. I want to go back to the time of sort of the implementation of Jim Crow, and even before, because this is an interesting contrast, comparing and contrasting this moment to the moment that we're living through now, because Reconstruction is important after the Civil War. And it's also important in the narrative that you tell in the book, Minority Rule. And it's important to remember Reconstruction, which through a lot of propaganda over the years got a negative rap to it, was actually wildly important, especially the first few years after the Civil War. This is when we get the election of the first black congressional members and senators to Congress, really from the South. And it was, as I think you said earlier, an attempt to create a multiracial democracy. And then you get the backlash to it, in which you compared, if you were to think of another time like now, it would be the implementation of Jim Crow. Tell me more about that dynamic.
Well, it's a remarkable period because it's the first time there's multiracial democracy in U.S. history. And it's the first time that previously disenfranchised communities are brought in to America's democratic experiment. And through the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, democracy starts becoming based on equality as opposed to whiteness and privilege. And so you have equality under the law for the first time through these amendments that are passed during Reconstruction. And it's not just remarkable, but it's remarkable how quickly the country changes, that enslaved people go to writing state constitutions and becoming black members of Congress from places like Mississippi and Louisiana. And there's not just black members, but there's integrated government, right? So you have blacks and whites working together to write these constitutions and to pass laws. But it's this remarkably brief period. And I mean, what it goes to show you is that democratic rights can be expanded in a dramatically short period of time, but they also can be overthrown in a quick period of time. And just because you put something in the Constitution doesn't mean that people are going to follow it. And I think that's also a really important point. And it just shows the extent to which the white South, and then I think over a period of time, the country more broadly, became committed to minority rule. Because in places like Mississippi and in Louisiana, there were South Carolina, there were black majorities. So the conservative whites were quite literally overthrowing a black majority and basically arguing for minority rule. They were basically saying the white minority is the only group that's fit to govern. So if that means that we need minority rule, then that's what it means for whites to take over. And even where there were black minorities, it was still integrated government. So you still had essentially conservative whites overthrowing the government that expressed the will of the majority through moderate whites and African Americans working together. And I think it provided the roadmap for minority rule more broadly in society. And it basically showed that there would always be these forces of backlash that met these forces of progress. And I think you can draw a straight line from Reconstruction, the backlash to Reconstruction, to the backlash to the Civil Rights Movement, the backlash to the first black president. Every time there's these moments that of what seem like remarkable progress in America, there's always these forces on the other side that feel threatened by that progress and are trying to roll it back through whatever means they have available.
Do you think it's accurate in going back to the Constitutional Convention in saying that perhaps the genesis, or at least what's at core of what creates this system that has allowed for a minority to rule it, was that the smaller states, in order to get them to sign off and eventually ratify the Constitution, was to give them equal representation both in the Senate and the Electoral College? Does it come back to these smaller states demanding some institutions be equally proportioned for them?
I mean, that's one part of it. I mean, there's all these compromises as part of the Constitution, but they're really more like concessions. And so it's the smaller states in the Senate. The slave states have an enormous impact because it's basically because of the slave states that we not just have the 3/5 clause, but the Electoral College. If James Madison and some of the other delegates from the slave states had made an impassioned argument for a direct election of the president, we very well could have had a direct election of the president. So, I mean, it's all of these privileged minorities in terms of how the Constitution comes together in its ultimate form, but also remember that what leads to the Constitutional Convention more broadly is a fear of democratic participation. That after the Declaration of Independence is written in 1776, which says that democracy should be based on the consent of the governed, there's all of these new state constitutions and these new state institutions. And the state legislatures that are created have a lot of power and are pretty democratic for the time. I mean, they're still white only, but a lot of poor whites are serving in them. There's frequent town meetings. There's frequent elections. In some places, regular people can instruct their legislators on how to vote. So there's this kind of experiment with democracy in the first decade or so of the country. The problem is there's an economic crisis. States start passing more populist policies, leads to larger inflation. It starts to hit wealthy landowners and merchants harder. They're the ones who are suffering from inflation, whereas it's the farmers, the tradesmen that are suffering from the economic crisis itself. And I think what the founders start to worry about is that the policies of the states are favoring the poor over the rich, and they are worried that the federal government, in the terms of the Continental Congress, can't really do anything. It's not even able to raise its own revenue. So they want to create a strong central government. That's one of the main reasons why they call a constitution. But they also want to check the populist policies of the states and make sure that their influence isn't threatened. And there's this quote from John Adams that basically says, if a majority were to rule, there would be a downright equal version of everything. Meaning that's one of the things they fear. They start to fear this notion of equality, and they start to have second thoughts about democracy more broadly. You start to hear prominent framers say, maybe we should go back to being a monarchy. Maybe we should try to shut out the people altogether. And then you have other founders that say, no, that's too drastic, right? but let's try to come up with some kind of middle ground where we'll have democratic institutions, but they won't actually be that democratic. And we'll make sure that our interests are protected based on how these institutions are written, either to freeze out the people altogether or to provide these specific protections for small states or slave states or whomever. And I think that really sets the tone for the country more broadly, which is that democracy is going to be constricted and expanding democracy is going to be difficult. Not impossible, but very, very difficult. And that means that there'll always be this push and pull between democratic and anti-democratic forces.
This is a fascinating history that you're talking about, Ari Berman, and not necessarily a controversial, what you said is not necessarily controversial among historians who know this period of time. As you mentioned, before the Constitutional Convention, there is an economic crisis. There's a debt crisis. Many farmers are going into debt, and there are popular uprisings against that. You have what was called, I think, Shays' Rebellion in Pennsylvania. And in some of these states, the legislatures were doing debt relief and even canceling debt. And this was one of the major impetus of why we end up getting a constitutional convention from the elites to try to stop that from happening.
Yeah, that's right. The elites start worrying a lot about the power of everyday people, and in terms of the economic crisis, it falls most heavily on farmers, on people that are not as prosperous, and so there's a view that the states are passing policies that are advantaging the less advantaged as opposed to the powerful, and there's also a feeling that the states are getting out of control. And, Shays' Rebellion, which is in Massachusetts, is one of those examples where you basically have these rebels who they're just kind of everyday farmers, but they try to march on the state armory in Springfield, and they want weapons, and they want to make sure that people aren't jailed for not being able to pay their debts. And it's kind of the opposite of the revolution. The founders are no longer the revolutionaries, right? They're afraid of another revolution. And this makes them question democracy, because what happens in Massachusetts is the uprising fails. It's put down fairly easily by the state government. But then there's elections, and people who want more debt relief, they're elected. And this makes James Madison very uncomfortable, because he says, if they can basically win through the political process what they couldn't gain through force, then maybe the democratic institutions are the problem. And there's a lot of literature that it's introducing and influencing the founders at the time of the Declaration of Independence that's based on the idea of majority rule. And Declaration of Independence really is a document that promotes majority rule. But after these uprisings in the states, Madison and others start to think, well, what if the majority starts to infringe on the minority? And again, when they're thinking of minority, they're thinking of a white propertied male minority. What if the majority starts infringing on the minority? What can we do about that? So they start to become worried about a different kind of problem. And in many ways, it's the rights of this privileged minority they want to protect in the Constitution, not the rights of the majority that they were concerned more broadly about when they wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Shays' Rebellion was in Massachusetts, not Pennsylvania. I knew if I talked too much there, I was gonna screw that one up. Another interesting point is early on, after the Constitution, there is very little democratic participation from everyday people in the system. I think 6% of people actually vote in the first presidential election. Even most white males at that time are not eligible to vote.
Yeah, so a lot of states restrict voting to white male property owners. So that creates a much smaller electorate. Then the way the Electoral College works, it's not like how it works today, where the people vote and then the electors follow how their state votes. Basically, the states were just picking their electors. So it was like 67 people got in a room and chose George Washington to be the next president. I think 43,000 people ended up voting. in that election, which was something like 2% of the country's population. So they voted in that election, but it was chosen by 60-something people that were the electors. And I think the founders felt like the electors chosen by the states will choose the president, and if they can't decide, the House will choose the president. But the idea that the people would choose the president, that was something that they did not envision. And eventually the Electoral College was somewhat democratized, as I said, so that there were popular elections, and then the electors were based on those popular elections. And things like the Senate democratized in that senators were appointed by the states and chosen by the lower house. Then they were directly elected by the people starting in the early 1900s. So the system has democratized, but I think it's democratized a lot less than we'd think. And my guess is that the founders felt like in 230 years, it probably would have changed more than it has been today, because they made the Constitution difficult to amend, but they also wanted it to be amendable. And of course, right after the Constitution is ratified, the Bill of Rights is added because the Constitution didn't protect enough democratic rights. So people think like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all of these core rights were in the Constitution originally. They weren't in the Constitution originally. They were added shortly thereafter because it very quickly became clear that the Constitution did not protect basic rights that people assumed that they had even at the time.
Yeah, we don't get the Bill of Rights until the first session of Congress. So not
exactly.
Out of the
Constitution. But I mean, I'm just saying, like, it's amazing they spend all this time in Philadelphia, and then they think, okay, we didn't even put freedom of speech or freedom of assembly in here. I mean, but I'm saying when there were 13 states, it wasn't that difficult to imagine amending the Constitution and finding 8 or 9 states to agree. There's 50 states, and you need 3/4 of states to try to ratify an amendment at a time of major polarization. That becomes a different and more difficult kind of project.
Well, in our time remaining, let's bring this to the current moment. I want to ask you, as we see a minority play the system and attempt to hold on to power as long as possible, as we have this demographic shift in the country, is there a point where the demographic shift can overcome this attempt?
Yeah, I mean, certainly theoretically, I think in some institutions easier than others. I think certainly in state institutions, which are more responsive to popular majorities, it could happen. It could certainly happen in presidential elections. The Electoral College is skewed, but it's not that badly skewed. But in some cases, it's going to get worse, right? Because a lot of the new demographics are moving to larger and more urban states. So they're moving to places like New York and California and Texas and Florida. Not all of these are blue states, by the way, but they are larger states. And so in terms of the skew of the Senate could actually become more undemocratic when it comes to demographic change, because the places that are losing population, North and South Dakota, for example, they're going to have the same level of power in the Senate, even as the population shrinks in those places. So there's this incredible stat that I cite in the book that by 2040, 30% of the country is going to choose 70% of the senators. So demographic change could actually make that worse. And so I think that's why we have to think about what kind of institutional change could happen in that sense. Because I think just assuming that the demographics will change a broken system, it's going to be difficult if there aren't outlets for those demographics to actually have influence on the system.
It is interesting to see. It feels like we are also having a geographic shift that's based on politics. Not only are people moving, say, to New York or California, where I am, but there are a lot of conservatives in California or New York or in quote unquote liberal states that are also actually moving to more conservative places. I think you see this in Florida. I think you see this in many states across the country.
Yeah, and we also, we don't know exactly how geographic sorting is going to go out. COVID changed a lot of that. You had people moving to more rural areas in some cases because they wanted more space, more land, things like that. We also don't know how the demographics are going to shift. I mean, Republicans assumed for many years that they were going to shift in a more democratic direction, but they might not. I mean, you're seeing Donald Trump doing quite well among some of these demographic groups that I think the Republican Party has alienated in the past. Now, does that mean they're coming to the Republican Party because they like the Republican Party, or they're just unhappy with Biden? I would argue it's because they're just unhappy with Biden. But nonetheless, I mean, it is kind of strange that the Republicans have spent all this time alienating these constituencies, and now they're trying to win some of them over because they see, for example, younger black men or Latinos, for example, unhappy with the Biden presidency. So I think some of these new demographics are up for grabs. I don't think it's assumed necessarily that the new demographic groups will always vote Democratic, although that certainly was the fear of people like Buchanan and Trump that would happen. But I'm not actually sure that's even the case.
Are you paying attention to what's known as Project 2025? Something
Yes.
comes out of the Heritage Foundation.
Yes.
What is that?
It's basically the blueprint for Donald Trump's second term, and I think it's basically a blueprint for an authoritarian form of government. And I think what's so fascinating about Project 2025 is the entire conservative movement is bought in to a Trump presidency with very detailed plans in a way that they weren't the first time around. I would argue the first time around, the things that they were basically concerned about was taking over the courts and maybe cutting taxes for the rich. Those, I think, were the kind of two priorities. But you didn't see detailed blueprints for purging the federal government of all nonpartisan civil appointees and things like that when Trump first got in there. I mean, it was chaotic. It was haphazard. Trump was basically making decisions essentially on a whim. And yeah, he had some backing, but the conservative movement has become so much more radicalized, so much more pro-Trump, and so much more authoritarian than they were before. And this is why I'm arguing that a second Trump term would be much, much, much more radical than a first Trump term, because Trump himself is going to be more experienced with wielding power, but also much more aggressive and authoritarian in how he wields power. His second term's all going to be all about retribution and rigging the system to benefit himself and to some extent his coalition. But then the fact that the Republican Party is bought into this and they have purged all of the dissenters from the party. There's no Republican dissenters in Congress anymore. There's no Republican dissenters that are going to be appointed to an administration. He's not going to put John Kelly in there or Rex Tillerson in there or people that are thought of as more reasonable Republicans. They're not getting jobs in the second Trump administration. Even the justices, they think that Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh are sellouts. Trump has been complaining about them, that they didn't do enough to overturn the election. They only want to appoint Thomas and Alito's nowadays. So, I mean, the Republican Party has moved so far to the right, even since 2016, that I think a lot of people are underplaying the threat of a second Trump presidency. They're feeling like, oh, maybe Trump didn't do that much bad stuff. Maybe he won't be so bad. Maybe he won't.
I mean, we survived the first one.
We survived the first one. I would say we barely survived it based on what happened in the country, but we survived it. And I think people are forgetting, like, the agenda for the second term is so much more extreme than the agenda for the first term. And given how democratic institutions are already skewed, my fear is that if Trump were to become president again, that it would make minority rule in some cases nearly impossible to reverse.
What states are you going to be paying most attention to in this year's election?
Well, I mean, some of the usual swing states, but I'm also focused on things that are happening at the state level in those places. So, for example, there's been a lot of fights over state politics in places like Wisconsin and Michigan. There's going to be really important races for local elections there. For example, the gerrymandering in Wisconsin that existed for a decade and a half has been struck down. So there's going to be competitive elections for the state legislature there. There's going to be really important state elections for things like the state Supreme Court in Michigan. There's a lot of things happening that are going to affect the presidential election, but also are separate from the presidential election that are going to matter a lot too. So I'm focused on some of those places, and then of course I'm focused on the battle over voting rights, and a lot of states changed their voting rights after the 2020 election to try to make it more difficult for Democratic constituencies to be able to vote. So seeing what kind of impact that's going to have on the ground in places like Georgia, places like Florida, I think it is going to be important as well. And then, I mean, I guess the third thing is, just what's going to be the impact of the election denier movement. That is so much more organized than it was in 2020. What are they doing on the ground, either to become poll workers and election officials, or to set up a situation where they're taking over election apparatuses so they don't certify the election if Trump loses, things of that nature. I'm also paying attention to.
Do you find that to try to undo this system of minority rule, you need to deal with it you need to start at the local level? At the state level?
I think so. I talk about at the end of the book about Michigan, because Michigan's a state government that was seemingly rigged, that began to put initiatives on the ballot to make the system more fair, doing things like banning partisan gerrymandering, making it easier to vote. Those are things that can be done in the federal level, but they're so much harder. There's basically so many impediments to change at the federal level, and the state level, the state courts, state constitutions, state institutions are more receptive to majority rule. That's not to say that majority rule always happens at the state level. You can certainly look at places like Texas where the opposite is occurring. But I think in general, change happens quicker at the state and local level. And not just happens quicker, but those institutions are more responsive to democracy being expanded and majority rule being promoted more broadly.
Because it's easier to start there, and maybe even more impactful than trying to get a constitutional amendment, which almost seems
Well, I mean,
insurmountable.
listen, if you want to get a federal constitutional amendment, you have to get 2/3 of the vote in Congress and 3/4 of the vote in the states. That's virtually impossible nowadays. You look at Michigan, where they changed the state constitution. They had to get initiative on the ballot. That's not necessarily that easy, but it can be done. Then once they get initiative on the ballot, it only needs a simple majority vote. So it's dramatically easier to change state constitutions, to change state institutions, at least in those states that allow for citizen ballot initiatives. Some states don't. Than it is, for example, to try to imagine amending the federal constitution.
And just quickly, just so I get this, and if you work at the state level, then eventually you could start to change the numbers in the Capitol, in D.C., to affect even a larger change or a shift.
Of course, because our federal government is based on a collection of states, right? So what happens at the state level doesn't just affect the states, it also affects institution in Washington and also what is thought of as politically possible as well.
Ari Berman has been our guest. Ari Berman is the author of the book Minority Rule: The Right-Wing Attack on the Will of the People and the Fight to Resist It. Ari Berman, I thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mitch. Great to talk to you.